This is obviously a stellar cast, so you won't want to be hearing from me, you want to be hearing from them. And I'm really conscious we have an hour and I want to make good use of every minute of it. So we'll jump straight in and go back to the beginning if we can. And maybe I'll ask you, Professor Ferriter, first. Where did this come from? How do we get this attachment to the idea, the principles of neutrality?
The first white paper on foreign policy in the States' history was published only in 1996, and they made an interesting reference to neutrality in that paper. They said that it's taken on a significance and a meaning for Irish people beyond the original practical considerations that underpinned Irish neutrality. I thought that was an interesting reference to it, and that got me thinking about what were those practical considerations historically. Let's go back 100 years. I love dragging people back 100 years, Katie, that's what I do. But it's very relevant here in relation to what was at stake during that revolutionary decade and the conclusion of that revolutionary decade and the negotiation of what became the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Neutrality was an issue raised there. It's not something we hear much about anymore. And Arthur Griffith, when he was selling the merits of the treaty as he saw it, he referenced this neutrality. And he said, we tried neutrality. We tried the Republic, obviously we didn't get that. We tried neutrality, but Britain was insisting on crown and empire. And, you know, we had to give way. And when you go through the treaty negotiations, you can see that the defence issue is kind of dispensed with fairly quickly. The bottom line from the British government's perspective is you are staying within empire, you are not going to exercise an independent foreign policy, therefore neutrality is not an option and you're not getting your own navy, and we will use any facilities that we deem necessary to ensure our security and our safety. The big battle then, of course, in subsequent decades is to try and claw back. People will be familiar with the treaty ports as they are known. They were deemed to be essential for Britain's control of its territorial waters. Neutrality is about geography as well as history. It is about the sea, it is about an island status, it is about us being behind another island. And of course they were famously won back through negotiation and diplomacy in the late 1930s. That allowed Ireland to declare itself neutral. Neutrality was never black and white. We shouldn't make the mistake of assuming that it was. Go back to practical considerations. Neutrality was not a constitutional issue in Ireland. De Valera did not insert neutrality into the constitution. It's not even mentioned. De Valera was not an absolutist about foreign policy, even though he's the politician most associated with what we call traditional Irish neutrality. And as we know, neutrality in public and rhetorically was very different from the practice. And one historian, Diarmaid Ferriter, has summed it up quite well by saying it was full of shadow language and shape-shifting. And that was necessary. We don't necessarily have to see that as a bad thing. It was often quite a diplomatic tightrope. But there's also the recognition, to go back to practical considerations, Ireland was never in a position to defend itself. It didn't have the wherewithal, the resources, or the commitment to actually fund a state that could defend itself in any real sense. The poet Patrick Kavanagh was very cynical about this in the 1950s when he said the Irish Defence Forces would perhaps be capable of saving a field of turnips from an invasion of crows. And he was trying to make the point that we shouldn't delude ourselves that we have some kind of moral superiority in relation to our neutrality. You know, we don't have the wherewithal to do this. But at the same time, he was also alluding to what was an interesting perception and a self-perception about what it meant. We shouldn't be dismissive about that. Neutrality meant, for a lot of people, the essence of sovereignty. The capacity to implement an independent foreign policy went to the heart of that programme of sovereignty, and it meant a great deal to people. And Elizabeth Bone, the novelist who was writing reports for the British War Ministry during the Second World War, she directly referenced that feeling. This is ERA's first free self-assertion, and as such, it means a great deal. And it did mean a great deal. It still means a great deal.
Conor, you obviously perused all this territory in your book and took us right. And predates, actually, because I think a lot of people would have thought of neutrality as coming from this revulsion after World War I, at, you know, what everyone had witnessed on the Western Front. And even maybe just before that to Connolly and, you know, we'll serve neither king nor Kaiser. But actually, we can go back further than that. You traced it further
well,
back.
yeah, the first well-known reference is by Wolfe Tone in a pamphlet he wrote a couple of years before the 1798 rebellion. This is when he was just kind of an up-and-coming barrister and political writer, and he wrote a pamphlet called The Spanish War, and this was Britain looked like it was about to go to war with Spain over some obscure trade route or something like that. And he was advocating, Ireland at the time had its own parliament, so he was which had no foreign powers relating to foreign relations or defence, but he was advocating that the Irish Parliament take a neutral stand in as much as that was possible in the upcoming war. But it's and he was talking about the benefits of neutrality, but as Diarmaid said, he was framing it in an expression of sovereignty more than anything else, and he was also framing it in an expression of this doesn't benefit Ireland to get involved in this war. This is a war about trade between Britain and the United States, or well, the colonies, and or I suppose it would have been the United States then, and Europe and Peking. You know, it doesn't benefit Ireland whatsoever, so why get involved? So he's coming at it from a very realistic point of view, not necessarily a moral point of view that, you know, neutrality is a moral position. He was coming at it from a point of view, this is a way to express sovereignty, because in the same pamphlet, actually, he also goes on to advocate for an Irish flag and other kind of expressions of sovereignty. So it's in that theme, rather than saying we should be, say, a permanent neutral. But of course, the war actually didn't end up breaking out for another 6 years or whatever, and the Irish, the Irish Parliament wouldn't have been able to do anything anyway. So it was more of a footnote in history than anything assertive. But then that goes, it's always been kind of a secondary or tertiary aim of Republican leaders. It's well down the list. And we saw that we had the Irish Neutrality League during World War I, where Griffith and kind of all the major names were, Connolly was a major part of it. But that died off very quickly. It was actually dwarfed by the conscription movement or the anti-conscription movement later in the war, and that's how we saw an expression of neutrality in that sense as well. But again, it wasn't an objection to even Ireland taking part in the war. It was an objection to Ireland being forced to send its sons and daughters. Sons.
That was a moment, because I think in many ways neutrality is sort of a concept, whereas that was one moment in time where that threat was very real, that actual young Irish men might be forced to go and fight, and it was a gift to Sinn Féin at that point, wasn't it? Absolutely,
and I think it's not stated, or it's not remembered enough how big a role that played in the rise of Sinn Féin.
Catherine, we mentioned Connolly there. Socialism and this policy are inextricably linked here, really, aren't they?
I don't know. It's very strange to be sitting here in my own city on the stage. I'm usually, when I do get to events, sitting down there. So I'm glad to be amongst the stellar cast there. I wouldn't put myself in the same role. And your question, like all politicians, I might come to at the end. But it's interesting that the court case taken by Ed Horgan is 20 years ago this year in April.
Wow.
And it's very interesting. And they point out, the judge points out that despite the grand historic value attached by Ireland to the concept of neutrality, it nowhere appears in the Constitution and it nowhere appears in legislation. And in that case, it's very interesting, and it's really worth reading because it's set out in crystal clear English that neutrality doesn't appear anywhere. However, the judge goes on to set out clearly that the Hague Convention, the 1907 Convention, is clearly declaratory of international law and neutrality. And he goes on to look at what we do in Ireland in relation to that, and it's worth quoting, and then I might try and come back to your question.
I was wondering if we were going to get back to that.
Well, I'm sort of tired of tunnel questioning, not you personally at all now, but neutrality needs to be debated, and it needs to be debated for longer. And I know when you sent the thing to say this would be 3 hours, I nearly dropped dead. She told me this would be a 3-hour debate. But we do need an open and an honest debate on neutrality and what it means. I'm absolutely a firm commitment, a firm woman who's committed to neutrality. I don't see any other way for us to use our voice in the world now more than ever. I could go down the road of quoting how many people have died in the Mediterranean this year as we build up Frontex Europe and build up borders. I can look at how we focus in on the Ukrainian war and rightly show solidarity, but ignore all the other wars in the world. That's all part of looking at what is neutrality and what does it mean. But I wanted to quote just from the judge, because he clearly tells us in relation to troops passing through Shannon, although he doesn't make it as specific as that. Okay. It does not appear to me, so the governments and various governments, you've used the word shadows, talk about a nuanced neutrality or a flexible neutrality. And he says, it does not appear to me that even that form, a qualified or nuanced neutrality, it appears to me that that does not even, it does not appear to me that even that form of neutrality is to be seen as including the notion that the granting of passage over its territory by a neutral state for a large number of troops and munitions from one belligerent state en route to a theatre of war is compatible with the status of neutrality in international law. So while not holding with the very courageous Ed Horgan in that on very specific reasons, that the two articles that Ed Horgan was arguing for, to say that the actions of our government in allowing troops through Shannon to fight in Iraq were incompatible with two articles of the Constitution. The judge didn't hold with that, but he clearly said there was international law, that the 1907 was declaratory of that, and our policy in allowing troops of the size and magnitude that we were allowing was certainly not even within the nuanced or the other word of neutrality. So what you asked me in relation to social, I can't answer for socialism. I can only answer as an independent Galway West TD who has seen it from every side. And lately in the Dáil, I have absolutely no trust in the government. Having read Conor Gallagher's book, and I congratulate you on it, I've read it from start to finish and underlined it. And what jumps out is the amount of devious actions, deceptive actions, all of the time, against what the people of Ireland wanted. Between the 1972 accession to Europe and the fiscal referendum, there were 9 referendums in total. The vast majority of those, the governments went out of their way to say, we're not joining up an EU army, we're not having a military alliance, we're not doing this. And all of the time behind the scenes, they were doing the complete opposite, clearly captured by Conor in his book, and so on. So what have I learned from the Dáil? Lately, we had a discussion on joining the European Defence Agency projects, 4 projects. We were told by the junior minister that that needed detailed scrutiny and oversight by the democratic process. We got less than 75 in total. We got 45 minutes for 7 opposition groups to debate that in an open and transparent way. So language has been turned on its head. The opposition asked at the very least for that motion to go to a committee, and the government refused that, while all the time saying this dull scrutiny of this. And there are many, many examples of that.
Okay. You brought us right up to date, but I do want to bring us back again, Fintan, if you can. You know, it's well documented that, you know, we've been neutral on the side of, side of America generally, or the US generally, but neutral on the side of the Allies, neutral on the side of you know, where the side our bread was buttered on, basically, right through, particularly through the Second World War. And we know Conor unearthed new information in relation to our arrangements with the RAF at that time and in currently as we stand. I think that shocked quite a few people.
Yeah, and I mean, Conor's done brilliant work on it and really important, but politicians have known about it. You know, I mean, it wasn't secret in that sense. You know, and you just ask the question, well, who is patrolling our airspace? You know, and I mean, I strongly agree with Catherine in relation to the lack of transparency, the lack of debate, the lack of openness. And I think it really is time that we confronted this stuff and genuinely thought about it. And I think we're prisoners of language for a start, right? We're talking about neutrality. And it's a terrible word for whatever it is Ireland has. It's not neutrality, right? You know, so we have this iconic notion. What would you expect a neutral country to look like? You know, and we know this from other examples from history. There's 4 things you would look for, right? One is you're not you refuse to become a member of any broad military alliance, right? So we tick that box. That's the one. The other three would be you don't allow foreign troops, particularly those engaged in war, to use your territory. You know, as Catherine was saying, well, you know, we did that on a massive scale for the Americans going to Afghanistan and Iraq. So we don't do that bit. And in fact, as Conor has revealed, you know, so well, not only do we allow foreign troops to use our territory, we invite foreign armed forces like the RAF into our territory on certain occasions. So we don't tick that box. We the third thing you would expect, right, is that generally neutrality means that you don't take sides ideologically. So it's not just that you're not part of a military alliance, but you actually don't comment on it. So during the Second World War, for example, you know, it was classic neutrality in that the government imposed censorship, you know, on private discussion even. So like, you know, the Irish Times was censored during the war. You could not express any pro-British or anti-German views in the newspapers, you know, because, no, we're neutral, so we have to keep that space. We don't do that, rightly. And of course, the fourth bit of it is that you defend yourself. You know, so you say, well, we don't join an alliance for our defense, we do it ourselves. And we don't do it ourselves, and we've never done it ourselves, and we've no intention of doing it ourselves. You know, there's a sort of weirdness in relation to all of this. And it has been hiding behind Britain, hiding behind Europe to a large extent, hiding behind America, and saying, well, sure, who'd harm us? Sure, we're just Ireland, everybody loves us, you know? And this sort of naivete, which is, even if it was ever true, is clearly not true now, right? So
it's not who'd harm us, though, is it, Fintan? It's if anyone did come near us, our big brothers would jump in and look after us.
And it's not. This is not theoretical, right? So we know the Russians have sent their ships out to make it clear to us that they know where the subsea, the transatlantic communication cables are, which are absolutely vital to the Irish economy, absolutely vital to, you know, everything about us. We would not be here having this conversation without them. And the Russians know, you know, made it clear they know where they are and are capable of taking action against them. What do we do in relation to that? I mean, I've said this before, but our policy seems to be to name our very few naval ships after writers, somehow in the hope that, you know, this will maybe send out a signal. And I think maybe the L.E. Samuel Beckett is the one that, you know, so we would go out.
It's going to strike fear into the heart.
We'd read passages of Beckett at them through a loudhailer, you know, and they would say, "Oh, I'm just feeling such ennui and existential despair. Why bother? Let's just all go home." You know,
the Geneva
that seems to be the policy, you know. And we've seen cyber attacks. There's another cyber attack last week on Ireland. You know, I mean, from Russia. You know, these are happening. They're real. So we ourselves have to get real about this stuff. And this does not mean, I mean, I think the red herring in all this is NATO, is, you know, we're joining NATO, all that stuff. But saying that we're not going to join NATO, which I passionately believe we shouldn't, is not then an answer to what is our policy. And very, very briefly, just to say, I think if we could scrap the idea of neutrality and look at two things which are interrelated. One is independence. What does an independent foreign policy mean now in a country which is a member of the European Union, for example? Well, I'll give you a simple example of this. It might mean being a lot more vocal when a convention which was hammered out in Croke Park in Dublin in 2008, the United Nations Convention Against Cluster Weapons, you know, was breached very directly by our great friends in America and Ukraine, who did not sign that convention. And what did we get? We got a really mealy-mouthed response from governments. You know, Micheál Martin, who was the Minister for Foreign Affairs, who was the host of that conference, that one of the great achievements of Irish foreign policy in recent years, said a general thing, well, we don't really like cluster weapons, didn't mention Joe Biden, didn't mention America, didn't mention Ukraine. So an independent foreign policy would look like standing up for those things. And finally, and very much related to that, is universality. What is our usefulness in the world if we are to be an independent country? And it's that we insist on the universal application of international law. Simple as that. We do not say that a war crime is a war crime when Putin does it, and it's not a war crime when the people that we like do it. Yeah. We stand up for universal principles which are contained in the United Nations Charter and the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's what we can be good at doing, and we're not doing it nearly as much as we should.
Okay. Catherine, you touched on it there, and I know you have said, you're on the record saying you're appalled and you're worried and you're really concerned about what our president has referred to as a dangerous drift towards NATO. Now, I would have loved if Katrina had found me somebody who wanted to join NATO to join our panel, because I would love to hear those arguments, trashed out. But I think I have two people here who were invited to that, what became very controversial, the forum on international security, the consultative forum. This was what replaced, we were expecting an assembly, a citizen assembly, and then somewhere along the line it was maybe decided, I'm sure Catherine might have a view that they were worried about what way a citizens' assembly might go, but we ended up with this consultative forum anyway. And I think, Diarmaid, you said you were invited and you declined.
Yeah, no, I thought long and hard about it, and I think we all agree here that it needs to be discussed and we want to see it debated. The question is it the appropriate way to do it, where you have invited hand-picked guests as opposed to there being much more engagement? We've often, and there's been very consistent polling for decades now in relation to a public attachment to neutrality. Now, people might define that in different ways, and that's understandable given everything that we've talked about. But it did seem to me that this was a particular subject and topic that would lend itself to the idea of citizenship and citizens engaging, because it does go to the heart of citizenship. We don't have a strong history in this country of public discourse about our foreign policy. You mentioned independence there, it's very important. When you look at the documents on Irish foreign policy, which there are many volumes of them now, and you look at how the architects of foreign policy originally are trying to find Ireland's place in the world. And Joseph Walsh, who was the first Secretary of the Department of External Affairs as it was, in March 1932, he said, we want to demonstrate to the world that Ireland is our name. We want the people abroad and the people at home to know we are independent. And it's actually quite sophisticated how they approach it. It's not necessarily weird, it's partly about being realistic about how a small state can design a foreign policy. And small states that are dependent on others for their security, they can't necessarily have one overarching grand design for their foreign policy. So they adapt. It brings us back to practical considerations.
Nimble is what you're saying.
It's what?
You'd have to be nimble in terms of...
But nimble, but there's no shame in that either, because you talk there about the size of Ireland, the location of Ireland. Ireland also experienced the consequences of occupation, of imperialism. We have strong views on those issues, and why wouldn't we have? So I would have liked to have seen that sense of engagement. I don't think citizens' assemblies, by the way, are the answer to everything. And, it's not some kind of utopia or democratic utopia. But I do think if we are taking seriously the idea of debating foreign policy and possibly a change, because change has certainly been mooted. We've constantly been told by political leaders that we have to evolve. And Micheál Martin did say in the Dáil that he thought a citizens' assembly would be an appropriate forum for this. But then that was sidelined in favour of something else.
But leaving aside your disappointment that it didn't emerge as a citizens' assembly, that first debate, what was wrong with the people that were picked? What was wrong with the lineup of the
Well, I didn't say there was anything wrong with them. No, I wasn't. I mean, there were. I suppose you're alluding to the comments that the president made.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah. No. Well, I didn't make those comments, and there were some interesting mixes. The problem a lot of people had was that many of the invited speakers had a history of being very firmly in favour of Ireland abandoning many of its traditional attachments.
But is that not fair enough in terms of an open and honest debate? That those views surely have to be...
Oh, they do. Yeah, no, and they do need to be part of the discussion. And this is not just an Irish issue. This is going on in Austria at the moment. Austrians have a very firm attachment to their neutrality, about 70% of them, roughly in the same ballpark as us. There are a lot of retired Austrian military chiefs who are engaged in something of a campaign to try and shift traditional attitudes.
As well, I think.
But interestingly, how they define their neutrality, according to their own chancellor, our neutrality is a peace policy. And that's what our neutrality should be. And again, you can draw on history for some inspiration in relation to that. The whole point, again, of trying to design a foreign policy was that small countries can have some kind of a say. They're not going to be deluded into thinking that they can prevent war, or indeed can prevent other war coming to them, but that they will use whatever they have to try and advocate for a resolution to conflict.
Conor, jump in here. You were at that forum.
Yeah, I was a moderator on one of the panels on the history of neutrality. It was a relatively uncontroversial panel, and it was academics, discussing documents. It was really interesting.
Did you have a sense there that there was a sort of a latent push to
I genuinely
push us further down the road towards NATO?
Well, no. So I did not think that it was a part of any kind of scheme to surreptitiously push us towards
Just
NATO.
note that Catherine's eyes are rolling over there. I'll be with you in a minute.
And maybe I'm too naive, but there's nothing politically for the government to gain in joining NATO.
But this is, honestly, this is what I'm going to come to you, because what is in it when you look at every poll that's done in terms of where people stand on this? I'm wondering why there is this. What is the political gain here if you were to take that?
There'd be no political gain. There's no pressure on Ireland at a European level to join NATO. There might have been in the past, but I think it's from doing interviews for the book. Talk to diplomats at the table for these type of things. It's not something that comes up in back rooms or in chats over cups of coffee.
Whatever about NATO, obviously, maybe that's not where the push would be, but to get more involved. Obviously, there is a push at European level to get more involved.
It's more of a European concept.
There is a push to get more involved in European defence, and that's happening.
This is the rapid reaction. What are they calling it now? Deployment.
Yeah, which we have been a part of since 2005, I think, but it was kind of it wasn't deployable because of all the political machinations behind it. This one will be deployable. I think generally it's probably a good thing, because this will be, if we've Kabul situation, we'll be able to send in, we'll be able to basically officially piggyback on people, and we'll be contributing to it. We'll be contributing a company of troops to it.
If we've any left at that stage.
If we've any left, unfortunately, yeah. I mean, we've had to pull out of UNDOF just to. So that's another maybe controversial thing. We're pulling out of a UN thing to get involved in an EU thing. But I do think the caveat to that is Micheál Martin and the government do clearly want to get rid of the triple lock, and this forum was definitely about setting the foundation, at least for that debate. Going forward, and I think that is something that will result from the forum. I'm not sure any other hard questions will be answered or any other actions will be taken on the back of it, but I do predict maybe the triple lock will be.
And do you think that forum was basically a conduit towards?
It's one of the reasons behind it. I do think they genuinely wanted to create more debate and discussion on these issues. The reason maybe they didn't want to have a citizens' assembly is because, well, that's probably 3 or 4 years away. There's a certain urgency.
Why would it have to be 3 or 4 years away?
Well, we've got lots of other citizens' assemblies to get through. Now, you could say, why couldn't they?
You can leap.
You could, because they were the ones who said that everything has changed as a result
fair point,
of the invasion of Ukraine. So it stretches credulity that they couldn't have shifted things around. Maybe they would be very concerned about what would come out of a citizens' assembly in terms of recommendations.
Well, I wonder, though, would you be surprised as well? Because we've seen citizens' assembly on abortion, the main one, where the minds of people were changed significantly by the experts that they heard. And there was an interesting study done last year where they did a poll, and they to one person or to one group they read a passage which really emphasised the unstable nature of the world, the underfunding of defence forces, and those people actually were in favour of joining NATO after hearing that passage, and the other control group were not in favour of joining NATO. Now, I'm not saying that's what should happen, but it shows that minds are capable of being changed depending on what's being heard. Neutrality is really dear to people, but perhaps it's not as in our DNA as we think.
As we imagined, yeah. Okay, Catherine, I know you've been dying to jump in on this. Answer this question for me, because obviously you've been so consistent all your political life on this. You were one of the trenchant campaigners against Lisbon for the reasons going right back, and the Shannon. Obviously, you took a big stance in Shannon. But what is in it for the government for this, I mean, this idea, and you pretty much accused Micheál Martin of trying to, you know, drag us towards NATO by stealth.
I didn't actually.
Well, will I pull out the quote?
Do, please.
No, but I mean, you do have a strong, you have expressed a strong suspicion, shall we say, that there is something else going on that we're not being overtly told at a political level.
First of all, you used the word that the president used, the word drifted. I use a much stronger word. The whole thing has been choreographed. That's my absolutely choreographed.
By who?
By successive governments, through lobbyists. And so we're being choreographed into a militarized Europe. We've lost any moral compass. We're talking about a strategic compass in Europe. We've lost any moral compass. We have normalized deaths in the Mediterranean. We have normalized ongoing wars. And so where am I coming from trying to answer your question? We set up a forum. Even the title alone is a funnel. Compare that with Dr. Ní Héalán, who's the UN Rapporteur. Watch her title, UN Special Rapporteur on the protection of human rights, fundamental freedoms, while countering counterterrorism. And why do I mention her? Because her title is very interesting. Number two, she went out to Guantanamo lately, and she praised Biden for allowing her in. And then she highlights that the vast majority of the 30 people in Guantanamo Bay are held without trial for over 2 decades. We can look at that, we can look at Palestine, we can look at the Sudan and so on. So why are we all the time talking about security in terms of a funnel as opposed to what the UN was set up to do? The UN was set up to promote human rights, to make a safer world. And what we're actually doing, Katie, if I just would, we're actually making it an unsafe world and going back to bad and good. These countries are bad, rogue states, these countries aren't. And these countries, including America, have behaved appallingly over the years in different countries in South America and so on. And there's no analysis of that. We go to Israel. I fully support the Jewish people, and I've read, but what they're doing in relation to Palestine is simply unacceptable and deplorable, and all we do is express concern. We express concern when Amnesty produces a report to say Israel is operating an apartheid regime. And what do? We give them special status in Europe as our special friend. So what do I want from a neutral country? I want an independent approach to foreign policy that has been said here. I want politicians that we can trust. I don't have to agree with them, but I want to trust them.
But answer me the question, because I'm genuinely intrigued
Micheál Martin stood up and he said, we do not need a referendum to join NATO. That didn't create confidence, did it? We don't need a referendum to join NATO. He said he was going to have it.
Planet, Kat, on any planet, on any political planet right now, do you see Micheál Martin or anybody else leading a campaign to join?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I think, in a sense, at this point, it's a red herring. But what we are doing is normalising the militarisation of Europe, which started with Lisbon Treaty, unfortunately, and we rejected it, and they came back with more reassurances that we weren't going down that direction, just like they did with Nice, with the Seville Declaration. I'm horrified as a woman, the amount of money that's gone into the arms industry. The figures are all in my bag. I couldn't regurgitate them without... You're talking $2 trillion per year alone on arms. How could that make us a safer country? How does it make us a family safer if we designate someone as the bad person? We're beyond that. We're wiser than that, or we should be. And we should be leading the way as a small, independent country, given our background and given what we've experienced ourselves, but knowing well that war doesn't solve problems. War can't solve a problem. At the end of the day, we have to have a peace settlement between the UK and Russia. We have to look at what happened, but that's a bad word. How did we get this far? Because you're immediately, like in the Dáil, being accused of Putin's puppets. I had never had any time for Putin. When the West wined and dined him, I had no time for Putin. But we're reducing all arguments to that, as opposed to Ireland saying, how in God's name can we bring peace? How can we use our voice?
But
it's become a bad word.
But peace isn't a bad word. But I'm saying, but what comes with peace is concessions, and I mean that's where the debate. And who decides?
There are concessions in every war, But what I'm really upset about is that we didn't use our voice all along to promote peace. And going back last year, there was a bigger chance of peace where Zelensky was open to that. And he certainly wasn't allowed by the big boys, by America and by Europe. So peace
That's not correct.
well, that's my opinion. You can disagree with it, but that's my
Disagree
opinion.
with it there.
Well, no, it's a really simplistic view of what happened at the time. I mean, Zelensky was not willing to engage in peace talks at that stage if it meant giving up any territory. I don't know what was going on behind the scenes, but I think that's one of those talking points that gets repeated, and it's just not accurate.
It is accurate, actually. There were moves for a 10-point peace plan in relation to it, and there were a framework around that. That framework has receded now because the powers have taken over. The arms industry, the amount of money that's going in promoting the arms industry, who are the biggest winners of this.
Can we just get back to the Europe question? Because sometimes I think we get sidelined by a focus on NATO. 60 years ago when we were knocking on the door, we wanted in to the EEC as it was then.
And we said then,
And there was
and we accepted that
there was no ambiguity.
But wasn't it accepted at that point in time that the ultimate end of this journey, this journey down the road with Europe, was going to be a common?
Well, what was said by the Taoiseach at the time, Sean Lemass, in 1962, was that we are prepared to yield our neutrality. We are prepared to go as far as this journey goes in the field of defence. There was no real ambiguity there. And then when you begin to trace his successors and also, of course, ministers for foreign affairs that they became, a lot of them asserted that we have no traditional policy of neutrality. And yet we constantly refer to Ireland's traditional policy of neutrality. But their focus was very much on the idea that if we want to sign up to the European programme, and that's where this debate is becoming very, very interesting. Where is that project for European defence going? And are we going to be a part of it or not?
But is it not? And I think
I mean more a part of it.
I'm just going to finish as for a while. I want to ask you that, because surely what's happening in Ukraine, whereas we're being told that this is the reason we must now reevaluate our security policies, our neutrality policy, because we have this extraordinary war raging on our doorstep. But surely, does that not make us take us further away? Because if NATO succeeds here to some degree, if they even if they fight them into a stalemate, whatever, that if NATO comes out good on this, does that not actually make a common European security policy goes back into the back burner? Like, there's no need for it if NATO is willing to police the world.
Yeah, so it's worth reflecting on the fact that 7-8 years ago, if we've been having this discussion, we would have said NATO's irrelevant. NATO itself is a dying entity.
And of course, it's all down to Trump as well.
Yeah, I mean, Trump was basically pulling out of it. There was less and less interest in it. You could say one of the reasons why things drifted so badly with Ukraine was that Europe and America were sending out such mixed signals about, was Ukraine going to join NATO or not? And it shifted all the time, and there was an immense amount of ambiguity and false expectations being created, false fears being created, all that pretty disastrous, I think. But one of Putin's great achievements has been to revive NATO. He's made NATO a vastly more relevant organization. And we whether we like it or not, we are being isolated further in that process, right? So at the European level, Ireland had a significant number of allies, who were neutral countries, and that's diminishing, and it's diminishing because of the Ukraine war. Particularly the Nordic countries, we could always kind of look to them. We could say, well, we share something with them. Now, what we never shared, of course, was we never actually put money into our own armed forces in the way they did. But with Finland, with Sweden joining NATO, the architecture is being remade, and we are in a very difficult situation in relation to that. And this is where us calling for peace, is great, but it reminds me of when Liam Cosgrave was Minister for Foreign Affairs, and when we were in the UN first. Cosgrave issued a statement at the UN calling on the Jews and the Arabs to settle their differences in accordance with Christian principles, you know, and like there can be an element of that, right? It is not. We do not have a right to tell a sovereign country which has been brutally invaded on what terms they should deal with that, right? It's not. It would be arrogant, dismissive, and I think
That's not what it's been said.
useful for us. No, but we have to be very clear that the degree to which we can influence those events in terms of putting forward a peace process or whatever is extremely limited. And what we do have to get a clear sense in ourselves. So we take NATO off the table, as I think we should. I don't think it's relevant. I don't think there's any political constituency in the country of any great substance that actually wants to do it. There would have to be a referendum, whatever Micheál Martin says. We could never imagine joining a military alliance without a referendum, and a referendum would not pass. But also, us talking about, you're talking about Ireland in NATO, it's like talking about should we join the Bolshoi Ballet when we can't even do the chicken dance at a wedding, We just don't, we're not in that game. It would take massive amounts of investment for us to even, become that kind of country. So if NATO's off the table, where are we? What is it? And it seems to me, I do not want to see the remilitarization of Europe. I think it's an absolute tragedy. I think it's appalling. But it has happened, and it's happened because Russia invaded Ukraine. We have to come back to that.
That's not true.
Well, it is.
It's happening for a very long time.
Yes, but the huge increase in military spending, which we're going to see over the next 10 years, is to do with the threat that Russia poses to many of the countries to which we are very close, small countries like ourselves. If I was in Latvia, if I was in Lithuania, I would want to have an army. I would want to have an air force. I would want to have some way of deterring the threat that Russia poses. And we can't be naive about this. It's there. This is a country which has actually attacked Ireland, right? Effectively, that huge cyber attack on the HSE, which caused enormous trouble for us, was done by Russia. It was done by private actors, but with the approval of the Putin regime. So we can't just hide behind all this and say,
I don't know who's hiding behind it, really.
But what I'm saying is, we have to face the fact that we do need to be clear.
Absolutely.
And the reason we need, I'm actually agreeing with you completely, Catherine, which is the reason we need transparency and openness and genuine debate is that we just can't go on kind of completely shifting around this sort of stuff and dancing on the head of these pins.
It's one of the reasons why the report of the Commission on the Defence Forces was such an interesting one, because one of the questions that has arisen is, do you fund a properly resourced your neutrality? So we're not talking about abandoning your neutrality.
Yeah, don't we have to defend neutrality?
Well, I mean, again, when we talk about Switzerland, the amount of money that is spent on neutrality, and neutrality that it's very proud of, it's a very costly enterprise. And again, it's also, it's much more a part of the public discourse. And again, geography is very relevant there. And, Finland shares an 830-mile border with Russia. So they have that particular preoccupation. But at the same time...
On that line, let me just ask you this, because it's interesting. If you looked at opinion polling in Finland, is one of the most interesting examples. Up until very recently, they would be... they would have been very slow to support the idea of joining NATO. And overnight, because the threat was so real on their border, that transformed the public opinion. And I'm wondering what could happen here if, for instance, there was an attack on those cables, on the data centres that we have here now that hold a huge amount of data for all of Europe. Could that be the moment where actually the whole debate is transformed and public opinion switches?
I think we have to maybe not be too quick to draw comparisons between Finland and Ireland, because we've very different histories, obviously. I mean, Finland fought the Nazis and the Soviets not too long ago. Then they had this policy of where they wouldn't criticise Russia. They weren't allowed to criticise Russia during the Cold War. And Finland would tell you they haven't considered themselves neutral since they joined the EU. They see the EU as a military project, just as much as they see NATO as a military project. So what they would have called themselves before, I think, is non-aligned, and they're quite prickly about it. Like, they say, no, we haven't been neutral since whenever they joined. Was it 92 or maybe further than that? But
there's no doubt that public opinion changed very dramatically.
It changed, right? But they had Finland has a culture of discussing security matters much more deeply embedded than Ireland. So they were a lot more informed about things. It didn't change overnight. It changed very, very quickly, but it was informed. And they don't have that same attachment to neutrality as we have. For them, it's a realistic foreign policy tool to be used as you see fit, rather than something that's intrinsic to your country's character.
The commission that you've mentioned, the Commission on the Future of the Defence Forces, they identified the risk of an attack on Ireland as minimal, almost non-existent, minimal. So we're now back into a debate about non-existent risks,
but can we really?
Well, they didn't identify the risk as minimal in relation to cybersecurity, for example. They didn't.
Generally, the risk was minimal.
Nobody's going to invade us, but that does not mean that there's no risk.
Let's try and broaden out the discussion. Is how did we get to this point, and what is the role for Ireland? Do we join up? We have consistently, and Lisbon absolutely captured it, where the European project has committed to militarisation. Absolutely. And progressively increase military spending. And then we look at housing, we look at the refugee crisis, we look at the wars. Surely Ireland, as a neutral country, should have an important role or voice in that, to say, hold on, instead of joining in this attack on Ireland. There has never been an attack on Ireland. And we will
Well, I think you find...
There was. Last year there was a huge attack on the HSE. I mean, it had a huge effect on everybody.
Just let me, because we're being channeled into the very tunnel and funnel that was the subject of the recent debacle, where I think there were two speakers, one from Galway that said keep the triple lock, and the other from Pana that argued for neutrality, out of all of the speakers. And we're back into that funnel, looking at it in a very narrow way. Now, that forum was never analysed on an independent basis. I wasn't at it. I missed it. I tried to get into it and I couldn't because I applied too late and I went on a waiting list. But in the Dáil, the minister, a minister for housing, made an interesting comment when Paul Murphy or one of those said, this is completely rigged, this forum. He said, it would be interesting to have an independent analysis of the speakers. And we all thought that was a great idea, but it never happened. So progressively, all of our debates are being funneled into a particular framework, which I really find worrying. It's extremely dangerous.
And I'm going to be throwing this out to the floor now, because I know we're coming to that time where I honestly, I think we should have 3 hours here, because we have at least 3 hours worth of material to get through. Just on the very fundamental question, the moral question, as we come back to whether this is a strategic or a pragmatic or a moral question, but is there a fundamental moral? I mean, I wrote this down, Fintan, because it struck me. You describe Putin as a murderous kleptocrat bent on the destruction of democracy in Europe and America. Like, is there ever a time where you have to say, actually, we have to fight this. We have to commit ourselves to this. Like, if all the good guys are pacifists and the bad guys are warmongers, surely the bad guys get to inherit the earth then?
Yeah, I do not believe, I would love to believe, but I do not believe that that we live in a world where military action is irrelevant, unfortunately. I'd love to be irrelevant, but if I was in Ukraine, you know, I'd be in the army, you know, you cannot, as you say, you cannot simply say, well, let's leave all the most poisonous actors to be the ones who arm themselves and exert military force, and there's no counterbalancing force. You know, the reality is there has to be. But we have to distinguish, I think, that from what's Ireland's role in this. What can we actually do? We can do a couple of things. I think we can do practical things to help Ukraine, some of which we've been doing. But we need to counterbalance that by saying, and I agree with Catherine about this, you know, which is that there is going to have to be a negotiated settlement. you know, to be realistic about this, to keep open that idea, not telling Ukraine what the settlement is, but accepting that if there is a role for us eventually to play in that we would be willing to play it. And in the meantime, trying to hold to a moral ground, right, which is not easy. Wars are ugly, brutal, nasty things, but it's not the same. You don't just say, well, it's a war and therefore everything is okay. So, for example, Philippe Sands, a person whom I hugely admire, has been setting up an international campaign to try to have Putin tried for the crime of aggression. I can 100% agree with that. But you can't say that if you don't say, well, actually, there was another war of aggression which was launched, which was the Iraq War, on exactly the same grounds. If it was a crime to invade Ukraine, it's also a crime to invade Iraq. If it's a crime to use cluster bombs. So the Americans themselves, the Biden administration, when Russia the invasion started, and they were asked about the use of cluster weapons by the Russians, said it's potentially a war crime.
Yeah.
And then you say, well, yeah, but we have to give it to them. Now, so what's the usefulness of somewhere like Ireland is to say the unfortunate, difficult things to our allies, right? Putin doesn't give a damn about what we say. But actually, if Joe Biden goes around saying, I'm really Irish, I'm Irish at heart, it's really who I am, it might matter, actually, for Ireland to be saying, we are your friends, and your friends tell you the difficult things at those times when they need to be heard.
Okay.
But we also need to remind ourselves of what a small, neutral country can do, because we've done it. There are over 80,000 Ukrainian refugees in Ireland because it's a safe zone, because it's a refuge. Yeah. And we have a particular history in relation to that we can draw on. And we've never been completely outside of European conflict. Hundreds of thousands of Irish people have been involved in European wars.
Okay. I am just conscious that all of you good people came along on this Sunday morning. Does anyone want to get a question in? Oh, yeah. Do we have a microphone? Yeah.
Hello. Thank you all very much for your interesting contributions this morning. I'm just wondering, in terms of the idea of having an independent position in relation to neutrality, in other words, nuanced, I think was the word I used. One of the problems I think we have, and I would love to hear your opinions, is given that we're economically totally dependent on the United States in terms of employment and investment, how can we be independent in that regard? Because until we become economically independent, we can't really forge an independent policy.
Yeah, isn't that, you can't, yeah, Conor.
Oh, well, I think it's a really interesting point, and Fintan at the start kind of gave 4 conditions for a neutral country, and I agree with them. But I also think that you won't find a country in the world that meets those conditions. They're notional or aspirational, and one reason why we can never be neutral is because we're a small country with an open economy that depends on America for a huge amount of our GDP. But even if you look at, Switzerland, the kind of template for neutrality, they also during World War II had to show that certain consideration towards the Nazi side, and did some pretty reprehensible things in terms of Jewish civilians living in Switzerland, as well as kind of the more traditional that we know about holding the gold and hoarding the stolen wealth. And during the Cold War, they were very much secretly leaning towards the Allied side, even to the extent of training with NATO side, even to the extent of training secretly with NATO troops. And you see that with other, until recently, neutral countries like Sweden as well. Kind of a moral superpower on the world stage, but secretly leaning very much towards the NATO side because they're part of Europe and they have to for economic reasons. So yeah, I think it's impossible for us to be neutral, a pure neutral in that sense, unless we become some sort of hermit kingdom.
There was great anger in the United States with Irish neutrality during the Second World War. It caused a lot of diplomatic tension. David Gray, who was the American representative over here, despised De Valera and the Irish government. And there's a determination after the war to try and repair that relationship. And even when JFK comes over in 1963, there's a sense of there's an opportunity here for us to be fully brought back into the Western fold, and that has economic aspects to it, of course. But there was also gratitude expressed for Ireland facilitating during the Cuban Missile Crisis, facilitating searches of aircraft coming into Shannon. So the Shannon story, doesn't begin in the early 21st century.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the unspoken reality in relation to why did we give Shannon? Why did we offer up Shannon? Why did we?
But
why did we speak so softly over the cluster bombs?
The problem here is that I think the questioner is absolutely right. It's a reality. We depend hugely on American investment, on our connections with America. But what do you do then? You behave like a good friend behaves, right? If a good friend sees you walking off the cliff, they don't say, "Yeah, absolutely, go ahead." That's really good. We need to try, and of course it has to be done pragmatically. Of course it has to be nuanced, but we needed to be consistent about saying, we hold certain principles, and they are the principles of the United Nations that we signed up to, and we would like you to do the same. And we will be critical in the way that a friend ought to be critical. And you see, America, for all its immense problems, is still a pluralistic democracy. There are still a lot of people in America who think that sending cluster bombs to Ukraine is morally, politically, and strategically wrong. So which America are we speaking?
But are they the people who set industrial and FDI policy?
Yes, yes, they very often are. In fact, I mean, I don't think most of the multinational companies, for example, want to see Europe becoming entirely, part of a military bloc. They value Ireland for its stability, for all sorts of other reasons, and actually having a sophisticated approach to these things, where we are willing to speak clearly about what our values are, and even if that involves us in being critical in relation to our friends, I think that enhances Ireland's attractiveness as a country.
Okay, now we're almost up at the hour, but I'm being told I could take a few more minutes. So if we can get a microphone up to.
Thanks very much. A change of tack. What does Irish neutrality look like in the context of United Ireland?
Yes, that was one of my questions that I had here, because we're going to be talking to unionists who have a long tradition of military association. Who wants to go here?
Well, the first point I suppose to make about that is, Europe has already accepted that a united Ireland could become a member of the EU as a single entity. And that raises important aspects of foreign policy. But then that entity, if it was one, would be part of this same conversation that we're having. And you're talking about trying to balance the different loyalties or the different traditions. How long have we been trying to do that? So, I mean, you're going to have new versions of the old problems, They're going to be 21st century versions of it, and we have to come up with 21st century answers. And that doesn't necessarily involve completely discarding history either.
Fintan, wrap your big brain around that one for me.
Well, I think it's a terrific question, and it emphasises further, right? If you're going to enter into negotiations about a united Ireland, you need to know what you think yourself first. You actually need to have a policy. You need to have a worked out sense of, what do we or do we not invest in defence? Do we or do we not have a navy? The territorial seas that we would acquire if there were a united Ireland, we've already got vast territorial seas. They would be even greater. How are they going to be patrolled? One of the things we haven't really talked about here, but we're looking at enormous investment over the next 10 years in offshore wind. One of our strategic goals, if we want to talk about security, is to become independent.
Saudi Arabia of
a sovereign country which is gaining energy independence because of our seas, because we happen to have the windiest place in the European Union. We want to become an exporter of energy. That would be our biggest single contribution to European security. Right? Forget about all the stuff about, weapons. I mean, if we were a country which was able to add to the energy independence of Western Europe, that would lessen Europe's dependence on the Saudi Arabias, the Russias, And of course, this is also, we haven't talked about climate change. I mean, climate change is the single biggest security threat that we all face. So all of these things are tied up. I think if the 26 counties, Ireland, developed a serious policy, which is putting together what kind of defence we need, what kind of strategy we have, what our climate change plans are, and how all of those things cohere, I actually think it could be pretty attractive in terms of talking about what a united Ireland might look like. You would have to compensate to some degree for the existing arrangements that are there by having ones that are coherent.
I see Tom Clonan writing in the Examiner actually that if we do build this extraordinary wind capacity, who's going to, the vulnerabilities there, and who's going to defend that?
But if you also, if Northern Ireland, if we join Northern Ireland, or if we became a United Ireland, sorry.
That is an interesting construction.
Yeah, well, whatever gets it done, you know. NATO is going to lose territory and population, and I think you might see increased international pressure on Ireland to join NATO, or vastly increase its defence, because the reason NATO are happy enough for us not to be out in it, because they do have the northern part of the island, they have air bases up there that are able to defend that kind of gap in Northern Europe. If they don't have that anymore, I think that's going to cause concerns amongst the generals and the admirals in Europe and America.
Interesting. Okay, yes. Have we got a microphone? Is there somebody else? I'll come to you in one moment. And who is somebody up here? Oh, yes, please.
Thank you. I would agree with Deputy Connolly that one of the greatest moral failures of our time has been the regularised deaths in boats in the Mediterranean. I'm up here on your right, Catherine. And one of the proximate causes of that, of course, has been the UN's failure to intervene in Syria, in the Syrian war. So we touched briefly on the triple lock. So I just wanted to get more opinions on, do we think the triple lock is actually fit for purpose when we have the great powers of the world at each other's throats, making the UN ineffectual in the short term at the very least?
Okay, Catherine, do you want to take that one?
I think the triple lock is fundamental to our concept of neutrality. Has it had difficulties? Absolutely, over the past, because the makeup of the UN has 5 permanent security members, all of whom have had a veto. America has been very much to the fore, like Russia, in using that veto, as have other countries. But I think what we need is a commitment that we joined up in 1955 to the UN, and actually, significantly that year, the manifesto from Einstein and Russell was published. I have it in front of me, no time to quote it, but they talked about actually learning from changing our ways, or we were facing disaster. And here we are in 2023 facing the same dilemma with no wiser, and talking about the big boys and should we join them or not. So I think the UN theoretically is the only place in town for us, and we should seek to reform it. And I know there was, and courtesy again of Conor Gallagher, they bypassed the veto to some extent by allowing for a General Assembly resolution, but it has really never worked. So I think we need to lead in calling for the UN to change, to make it right for the 21st century, and that's not happening. I despair at what's happening with Europe, because we're ignoring the UN absolutely all of the time, bit by bit. We're in a European Defence Agency, we have European Defence Agencies, I could read out all of them. Partnership for Peace, which is really partnership for war. We have PESCO, and we have all of these entities that we've gone into bit by bit with absolutely no scrutiny. When we joined PESCO, we had 2 hours in the Dáil to analyse or scrutinise that. And so, what am I saying really? The climate change is the elephant in the room. The gentleman at the back that asked about America and being dependent on, of course we're dependent on lots of countries, but that doesn't stop us speaking out. And we need to speak out and say, cluster bombs, interestingly, America, Ukraine and Russia were the 3 that didn't sign up when the convention was held here in Ireland. Imagine sending cluster bombs out, while at the same time we're justifying sending soldiers out to help the Ukrainians demine. And you know, the irony of all of this, so none of it makes sense to me, but it's really, really worrying. So I go back to the UN as the framework that needs to, the agency that needs to be reformed, and I go back to the non-aligned countries, which we haven't even spoken about at all, which came together significantly in 1955 when we joined the UN. The non-aligned countries came together for the first time, and we had the manifesto from Einstein and Russell at the time warning us that we needed to change. War would lead to universal destruction, and we're on the verge. Can you imagine we're talking flippantly about a nuclear war and using nuclear arms? We're flippantly talking about that. Climate change is mentioned in the Defence Forces, that commission. It's mentioned as one of the problems, as opposed to being a direct consequence of the arms industry and war. The two go hand in hand. We can't talk about climate change if we're going to be warmongering. And I am not naive in relation to war. What Putin has done, absolutely. I've never stood over what Putin has done. But at some stage, we need to analyse how the world got to this stage. What happened before the invasion? What happened with the Minsk agreements? What happened with the understanding? We know from Merkel in Germany that she said the Minsk agreement was simply to gain time for the Ukraine to build up its arms industry. And now we're sending cluster bombs. Why? Because they don't have enough artillery on the ground. And meantime, the big companies are making astronomical profits, and the world is more unsafe than it ever was.
Okay, I'm really out of time, but I promised you I'd let you in, so.
So a question for Conor, and Conor, your book, chapter 11 of your new book, The Dreaded N-Word, you've an interview with Lieutenant Colonel Ray Lane, and he served in Afghanistan, and you quote him saying, he was involved in the more aggressive side of the response, helping to track down and kill Taliban bombers. This included assisting US forces in directing airstrikes against targets responsible for IED attacks. So is that a dog whistle to people who want to run around Afghanistan like an outlaw? Or are you aware that Lieutenant Colonel Ray Lane from the Irish Army won't face any censure for, as you quoted again, being involved in the more aggressive side of the response, helping to track down and kill Taliban bombers? Thanks.
It's certainly not a dog whistle. It's a anecdote I included to illustrate how international missions, which we would describe as peacekeeping, and was described, you know, the ISAF, the mission we contributed to in Afghanistan, had a UN mandate, so it fell under the triple lock, etc. But it did have a hard edge. And a lot of those other missions have a hard edge where you're actually engaging in kinetic warfare. Like East Timor, we sent the Army Ranger Wing over to East Timor. That was a peace enforcement mission. We had soldiers in the jungle shooting guys. Now, they don't like to talk about it. They were clearing out sectors of rebels, grid square by grid square. It's not something we talk about because the level of debate about those issues is so it's so poor. But so that's why that was included, to show that these missions are often a lot less benign than they might appear. It certainly wasn't a dog whistle, though.
Okay, I really need to fit. Is there any woman here at all who wants to ask a question? I think one of the problems with this debate is not enough women's voices are in it. Anyone at all? Don't let me down. Katrina, one last question.
I don't really have a question. I think it's been a fascinating debate, and I think it's a very interesting moment for us. When I was younger, I thought our stance during World War II was a disgrace, a moral disgrace. I thought we should have been fighting the Nazis. I admired hugely the young men who went to join the RAF and actually helped to win the Battle of Britain, which could have changed everything if it hadn't been won. And I really dislike notions of moral superiority around neutrality. I believe it is not a religion or a cult or something that we can't examine in some detail. I think it is a good thing that we examine it properly and that we stay neutral if we can, within parameters that are sane and rational, and still allow us to have some moral compass about things like the Nazis during the Second World War and indeed Mr. Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So it's difficult. I mean, De Valera had to make a decision in terms of World War II. It was very soon after the end of the Civil War. There were many people in this country who would have supported Germany, and we could have had another civil war if he hadn't made that decision. I think it was the correct one in hindsight. But it wasn't our finest hour, and we've got to face that too. There is no moral superiority in neutrality as such. It is in itself a neutral concept.
Are we not back at a very similar position, though?
In some ways we are, but I think genuinely, Fintan laid out for us the difficulties that exist in terms of our own armed forces here. We have to do something about that. We have to be able to patrol our seas and our skies properly. Now, that's going to cost a lot of money. If everyone is so attached to the idea of neutrality, as we're told time after time in polls, are they willing to pay some money for it? In the same way as we're already attached to the idea of United Ireland, until the notion of extra taxation comes up, or changing our flags, or having a different national anthem. No, no, no to all of those. So it's not as if the Irish people, whoever the hell they are, have a monopoly on either wisdom or proper information about this, which is why debates like this are important, and why I hope we do have a citizens' assembly in due course to talk about the issue of neutrality, because it is, as we have seen this morning, very, very complicated. And we need to remove it from the realms of moral superiority and bring it down to earth to look at what is actually practicable for a small country like ours in terms of both assisting people who are in trouble, and I support Catherine fully on the dreadful situation in the Mediterranean. The Ellie Samuel Beckett, by the way, was one of the great heroic missions in the Mediterranean for a few years, where they were picking people up. We had some of the people who served on that ship here in Galway a few years ago, and they were remarkable. So I don't have a question. I want to reflect at length on what I've heard this morning. I think everyone should read Conor's book to get themselves up to date where we are. And I think we have a lot more to talk about and to think about before we're done with this issue. And Katie, thank you. And thank all of our wonderful speakers this morning for coming along.